Hi, everybody. I'm Big John, and this week on Liberty Lens, a 37-year-old ICU nurse named Alex Pretti was shot and killed by the U.S. Border Patrol in Minneapolis during yet another immigration enforcement operation. Trump administration officials have said that he was an assassin who had a gun and violently resisted arrest. However, videos and witnesses tell a very different story. Tonight, we're going to unpack what really happened and ask perhaps the bigger question. When the state kills a citizen and controls the narrative, is that tough law enforcement? Or is that something that tears at the very fabric of our republic? And as always, here to help me suss out all the issues and perhaps make some sense out of everything, none other than my friend and co-host, RLC member, Mr. Mike Termott. Mike, how are you doing today?
John, it's good to be with you. It's good to be with you during these wintry, icy, snowy times across the United States. I'm sorry, once again, that I have to say, I'm sorry that it's under these circumstances. I'm sorry that we are now analyzing the second, and there have been others, but now we're spending a whole episode for the second time analyzing an ICE shooting that led to a death. And I'm glad that you and I are going to take the approach that while the case itself is important, and we're going to spend some time talking about the case and what happened, that the implications of the implications of the case itself and how we got here are important, and there are important implications of how the government at various levels is handling this and implications for going forward. So thank you in advance for all of that.
Yeah, I share your sentiment that it's important that we discuss this, but at the same time, it's also incredibly disheartening that we have to discuss this and that we're in the position to try to suss out yet another tragedy. All right, so this on January 24th, as has been almost the daily case in Minneapolis, there are ICE enforcement actions and there are protests. We touched on, I believe, last week. Look, neither side is acting very responsibly here. On the one hand, you have the Trump administration that is trying to be tough, trying to signal its toughness and its commitment to these immigration enforcement actions. And on the other side, you have the local populists, the local politicians, the Governor Walz, A.G. Ellison, the mayors saying, "Hey, this is basically a Gestapo operation, and we need to resist it. These are not tactics that we need to abide by." And there's been no intra-agency cooperation. We've covered that. We'll cover it again. But on the 24th, during one of these operations, Alex Pretti, a 37-year-old ICU nurse and a U.S. citizen, was shot and killed by Border Patrol agents. Now, as you and I have always lamented, seemingly within minutes of the incident, aside from the typical Insta responses that you would see on social media, perhaps more importantly, you had the Trump administration trying to grab hold of the narrative, trying to set the tone of the narrative. And here's some quotes from high-ranking officials, Mike, and I'll ask you to reply to them. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said Pretti approached officers with a handgun and violently resisted the officers, thereby implying agents fired in self-defense. Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller went even further. He labeled Pretti a, quote, would-be assassin and, quote, domestic terrorist who tried to murder federal law enforcement. Border Patrol Commander Gregory Bovino, who has quickly shot up my list of favorites, echoed and amplified.
Sarcasm noted.
Yeah. Echoed and amplified the threat framing, stating or suggesting that Pretti may have intended to massacre law enforcement. In other words, he wasn't even speaking to facts or perceived facts. He was speaking to intent. And again, all these statements were made almost immediately in the aftermath of the news breaking of the shooting. Before we switch over and be fair to get some of the stuff that was said from the Minnesota side of the fence, Mike, tell me your reaction to these and other statements. We have other statements, but those were maybe perhaps the highlights or lowlights from the Trump administration.
Yeah, well put. And by the way, we are going to be awfully critical of these really dopey things that were said by federal government officials and the dopey things that were said by Minnesota and local officials as well. I should note that this is going to be one of those episodes about which you're going to be disappointed if you just want to take sides. If you just want
Right.
to, if you want your team to come out ahead and you want to feel good about how smart politicians are on your team, this episode may not be for you. If you can't handle nuance and you can't handle reality, this may not be an episode that's going to let you sleep well, because there's enough dopiness to go around. You and I have said this many times. I'm not going to put up with people saying that you and I are not supportive of protesters, because we are.
Right.
We think that you should be out there protesting when there's something wrong. I've argued you shouldn't be doing it in the face of police officers. You should be doing it in the face of decision makers. But that's maybe one step that's more subtle. And we agree with the president's. At least I should speak for myself. I agree with the president's agenda of getting some control over our southern border. We are a nation of laws, and therefore we have to enforce our immigration laws. ICE is the agency tasked with doing that. We're not arguing that ICE shouldn't be uh, pursuing its mandate, particularly given that there's a political mandate to do so as well. What we are talking about is how all of that is executed, right? And what happens because of it. The statements that came out to start to answer your
Mhm.
question, the statements that came out immediately after the shooting were dopey on, I think, two different levels. One is that there were statements of fact made at all.
Correct.
Law enforcement doesn't do that. And there's a reason law enforcement doesn't do that. Law enforcement doesn't do that because you don't have all the facts right away. And because there are always going to be facts that come out that make you look silly after the fact. You come out and you say something, and then 24 hours later there's more facts, and what you have said on the record makes you look dumb. And you don't want to do that, right?
Right.
You don't want to do that. And doing that undermines your credibility, undermines the agency's credibility, and it can bias prosecution. It can bias juries if anything were to go to trial, either in a civil sense or in a criminal sense. Or at the very least, there'll be attorneys who are accusing you of bias. There are
Right.
all kinds of reasons why you don't shoot your mouth off right away.
Right.
Not the least of which, in this particular case, one of your objectives should be to get the community to settle down. And
Right.
I don't get the impression that anyone was trying with their rhetoric to get the community to settle down.
Well, there's 2 points, Mike, right? I agree with you. The initial rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration, not only was it not de escalating the situation, one would argue that in combination with what happened in the Renee Good incident and the heavy handed approach to the enforcement actions, it's not just I would argue it's not an isolated incident of being tone deaf and not an isolated incident of not reading the room, but a conscious decision to not care about the temperature in Minnesota.
So it would seem. I agree with you, John. So it would seem, particularly, not only, I agree with you wholeheartedly if the greater context includes what has been happening.
Right.
But consider the greater context of law enforcement in general. Consider the past 100 years, right?
Right.
When these things happen, you need to say, I think there's two basic things that you need to say in some version, along with whatever dopiness you're going to say. There's two
Right.
things that need to be said, which is, if we screwed up, we're going to hold accountable those who screwed up.
Right.
If you do not say that, you leave the impression that it's not going to happen. And
Well,
that's because, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mike. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I needed to jump in because I feel my teeth about to fly out of my mouth. Not only has the Trump administration left that impression, not only have they connoted that that's not going to happen, they've denoted that it won't happen. The vice president famously said all federal officers have absolute immunity, which, by the way, is a made up qualification.
Not
There's no
only
such
is it a
thing.
made up, it's a made up phrase, not a term of art,
Right.
a made up concept. There's no
Correct.
such thing,
Right.
and it's not even qualitatively true.
Right. So, but
What he
even
means is that he should be held accountable at the federal level, not the state level.
well, does he mean that?
We hope we hope,
Well,
please God, that that's what he means.
well, correct. But even more troubling is, was that a Freudian slip? Was it him saying, "Look, complain all you want. We're in charge of the investigation, and we're not going to have one. We've decided."
Or if he is prosecuted, we're going to figure out a way around this, even if it includes a pardon. That's what it put in our heads.
Right. So, on the very least, at the very least, it was a PR disaster for the vice president to say that. And then, up until this Pretti situation, nearly every MAGA Republican falling in line behind that. Because it's not just the first guys that trot out this sort of messaging, it's every other elected official. And we'll talk about that later. But I would argue that they are very consciously aware. These are not missteps. These are not misstatements by people who don't know how to act in front of a camera. These, to me, seem to be very conscious efforts by presidential admirers / sycophants to make sure that the president's political message is amplified throughout this whole process. So it's not that they stopped and considered and said, like, was he really an assassin or not? Like, even in the Renee Good situation, you and I went back and forth. Even though I disagreed on what happened, I think reasonable people can say there was some doubt going on there. But
Well,
with it,
and it depends on, as we discussed, what question you're asking. If you're
right,
asking, was it good police work? I think it's clearly the
no,
answer is no.
right,
Even if you're asking, was it bad police work? The answer is probably got to be yes. No, not probably. The answer is yes. If the question is, should he be investigated criminally? The answer is yes. Will he likely be found guilty
right,
in a criminal court by a jury
none,
based on how the law works in this country? My guess, which is irrelevant because I don't think it's ever going to go to trial, but my guess is that he would not be found guilty because the law sets such a high bar for that, right? But to your point, yes, you can discuss these things. And to your point more broadly, given the complex nature, given the nuance, why would you then, given a second opportunity to handle it right,
yeah,
just a couple weeks later,
yeah,
handle it so badly? Let me go back to where we put a pin in. There's two
sure,
things you got to say. One is we're going to hold people accountable if we determine someone did something wrong, right? Because that's what
right,
the community needs to hear.
absolutely,
And then the other thing that you need to say is, let's not jump to conclusions.
yes,
Let's, let the process play out. There will be facts that come to bear. The police officer, maybe there's things that happened. I wasn't there. You weren't there, right?
right,
Uh, Police officers have to react fluid, tricky, training, well-intentioned, yada, yada, yada. These are the things you have to say because you have to hold your police force together too. You can't just throw your police force under the bus immediately either.
agreed,
Which
agreed,
is why so often you'll hear a police chief or the information officer representing the police department or representing the community, if it's community policing where this
right,
happened, not in this case. But you'll see someone say, at least ostensibly, we stand behind our officers, we stand behind the department. They were trying to, this is what they were trying to do. Obviously, things went wrong. if our officers did something wrong, people will be held accountable. Wait for the investigation. That's basically, you pull the string out of the information officer. That's what has to come out, right?
Right.
Those two things, to settle everyone down and to make your own police force think that you're not just throwing them under the bus.
At least on a pro forma level. At least just say it. But to your point, and what I'm saying is, this is an active, conscious decision to victim blame, and to go far beyond saying just we stand behind our officers, or even
And I'm reinforcing your point, because what I'm
yeah.
saying is,
Yes, absolutely, yes,
so pro forma
yes,
is those things that need to be
yes,
said, that when
yes.
you don't say them,
Oh, it's suspicious on its face.
right,
Yes,
there's
yeah,
no runners on base and there's a ground ball hit to the second baseman, he
right,
throws it to first because
right,
that's what you do. Now, if you decide to throw it to third,
right. Yeah, yeah, I got you. Yeah, no, it's just very strange. And to your point, prior to this happening, say after the Good incident, prior to the Pretti incident, I want to focus a little bit because I think it's not being talked about enough. The deployment of this guy, Gregory Bovino, from Texas to Minnesota and becoming sort of like mouthpiece number 2 after Nome for what was happening in the area. And clearly, this guy, I don't know him, but just from his public statement and his public facing, somebody who wanted to project an image of strength, somebody who wanted to project an image of we're not going to put up with any BS, someone who definitely has that FAFO, F around and find out sort of attitude to him. And again, to how perhaps the administration and how perhaps President Trump wanted to initially portray this was, we're doubling down. You're not going to get some touchy-feely spokesperson. You're not going to get some touchy-feely commander on the ground in Minnesota. You're getting this guy who doesn't put up with anything. Don't take no crap off of nobody, as they may say down in Texas. Do you think that someone like him was initially part of that post Renee Good, pre Alex Pretti, even before this incident happened, that this was the administration doubling down on, in the best of light, say we will not be intimidated by local refusal to cooperate, local refusal to share information, local refusal to get on board with our plan?
has to be. Can't, there is no other explanation. And I say that again in the context of what's the way these things always go, right? What's the way that these things always go, because that's the way they should go, and because law enforcement is not a brand new industry in this country. It's not like, this was invented last Tuesday.
Right,
We have a 100-year history of, well, look, law enforcement has improved a great deal over the decades. Even during the relatively brief 11 and a half year period in which I was in law enforcement, we saw improvements. So I realize in the grand scheme of things, this is fluid, but we have many years now of every agency in the United States understanding you do not talk to the press. Nobody talks to the press unless I tell you you can talk to the press. And that
mm,
means the chief or the chief information officer, and that's it. Talking to the press is a good way to spend the next 6 months at a desk.
right,
I don't know if it's hard to fire a civil servant for doing something stupid like that, but you're going to have your life will be worse, right? If the boss catches you talking to the press.
right,
And if you are talking to the press, your life is going to stink, even if you have permission. If you're the chief, your life is going to stink if you say the wrong thing,
right,
much less twice, right? Can you
right.
imagine the chief of police saying something political to the press and not getting a phone call from the mayor? What would that mean? That
Oh,
would mean that a whole lot of people approve not only you shooting your mouth off, but what it is that you're saying.
right,
So the answer to your question is, yeah, he's got to be a part of something. Someone decided that his lips should be moving. And I I don't see it as credible, the idea that you didn't know the style of stuff he was going to be saying, right?
right.
Now, maybe the administration was surprised that he was so bad at it, that he
Right.
was so aggressive.
Or so good at it from their point of view. I mean, I can't
That is the
discount that
point you're
possibility.
making.
Yeah, I can't discount that possibility, Mike, because he I mean, he proactively went on X to malign Pretti. I mean, it wasn't just somebody asking him and he shot off his mouth, as stupid as that would be. He proactively went out and said, "I'm defending these guys," blah 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 blah. Anyway, so to the incident,
Let me
go
introduce
ahead.
a concept
Yeah.
here that you and I haven't discussed. So if you're mad at me for bringing it up, I'll understand. Um, I used to teach a lot of business school classes. And before that, I learned this situation through observation. When I worked in Washington, I noticed one day that the head of Fannie Mae was a lobbyist.
Okay.
Think about that. One of the world's largest and most sophisticated financial institution that implicitly had government backing, right? That did eventually bring down the economy of the United States in 2008. But,
Right.
I'm talking about a decade and a half before that, 10, 15 years before that.
Right.
We noticed that the head of Fannie Mae was a lobbyist, wasn't an economist, wasn't a financier, wasn't a banker,
Right.
wasn't a lender, wasn't a was a lobbyist.
Right.
The saying that we always rely on is you can tell a lot about an institution by who leads it. You
Right.
can tell what's important. Boeing used to be run by engineers. You put sales and marketing people and financiers in charge of that organization, airplanes fall out of the sky.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You get my point.
Yeah.
And I learned that through direct observation as well, because the guy who was put in charge of straightening out the 737 project was an old lab partner of mine in college. And he was the right choice because he was a magnificent engineer. You don't want some schmuck like, you and me, finance guys in charge of an engineering outfit when the problem is how well the engines perform, right? You get where I'm going.
Yes.
Okay, so what is the center of gravity of an organization that thinks it's a good idea for the face to be this guy shooting his mouth off about being tough in Minneapolis?
Right.
That's a problem.
Right. Well, there's a lot of problems, not only with Bovino. I think Bovino just exacerbates the problem. But one common theme throughout this is no one from the Trump administration, with the possible exception of Holman, and we'll talk about him later again, is a cop. No, but none of these actions are being run by cops from the federal side.
Thank you. And this is my point. Kristi Noem has no law enforcement experience, and as she is demonstrating through her commentary, no law enforcement understanding.
Yes.
No law enforcement understanding. Like, if you're going to say the kinds of things you're going to say, you should at least know that it's a possibility that our facts are going to come out. You should at least know that you're taking a risk, right? That you're shooting your mouth off prematurely. And this would be a good time for me to jump in prematurely and tell you something that you want me to say 10 minutes from now, not now.
Okay, go ahead.
Kash Patel has never been to a law enforcement training program either.
Oh, don't get me started on him, because I think the comment you're referring to, of course, is I believe he was being interviewed by Maria Bartiromo, and we're kind of mingling stuff, but that's fair.
Okay. I don't know that we are. I think it's all of a feather, but keep going.
Right. Bartiromo, as we sort of indicated, joining several MAGA supporters, several Republicans who were truly shocked at this, I think, at this incident. And more importantly, shocked at the response of the Trump administration to this incident. She was interviewing Kash Patel, and Kash Patel was spouting out things like, well, he was a concealed carry, but you don't bring a gun to a protest. And he threatened, he got involved. He impeded a federal law enforcement action. He impeded federal agents. Even at that point, after having the opportunity to watch the second wave of videos at that time, still mouthing off nonsense. I mean, to the point, not just to your point that he seemed like he had no idea about law enforcement despite his alleged pedigree. He was also displaying a blatant ignorance of the Constitution that, for example, you can't exercise your First and Second Amendment rights concurrently. Like you have to pick one or the other. If you're going to protest, you can't.
That is the way that it came off. I don't know that
Right?
he meant it that way, but it certainly came off that
Yes.
way. And I think the reason public officials say such dopey things sometimes because they're ill motivated, sometimes I get the impression they hadn't really thought it through before. Like they're thinking about these issues for the first time with a
Well,
microphone in front of their face. Like
right.
don't bring a gun to if you're a libertarian and you're starting a sentence with "don't bring a gun to a,"
Right.
immediately hair stands up in the back of your neck, and it's like, whoa, how am I going to finish that sentence without being a jerk?
Well, you don't even have to be a libertarian because allegedly MAGA folks are strong 2A supporters. I mean, if there's anything that one of the defining things of being a MAGA acolyte is I have the
Wanting
right.
release of the Epstein files.
Well, that as well. But I'm saying in terms of your constitutional rights, it's carry. And this guy was a concealed carry, properly licensed.
And that brings me to what it was that made me look up whether Kash Patel had ever been to law enforcement training. He said something so dumb
Okay.
that I almost broke my neck.
Well, he says a lot of dumb things, so you may have to narrow it down for me.
This is the specific one. And I
Go
call
ahead.
this the clock striking 13. When the
Yeah.
clock strikes 13, not only do you not know what time it is,
Right.
you don't know what time it ever was.
Correct.
Meaning, all you know is the clock is broken.
Right.
Right? You can't trust, a few hours ago when it told you it was 8 o'clock, was it?
Right.
You can't trust anything. Okay, this is what he said. I paraphrase, I won't get exactly the perfect quote, but when you bring a gun loaded with multiple magazines, it can't go well. Okay. To a protest can't go well. How do you load a gun with multiple magazines? Definitionally, only one fits in the gun at any one time.
Right.
And this snapped my neck so hard, I actually asked ChatGPT, like, what's up with this phrase? And
Right.
ChatGPT says back to me, it's nonsense. Uses the word nonsense. My ChatGPT is so respectful, right?
Right.
Now, it thought it was talking directly to me, not about someone else, right? But it basically said, you are nonsense. And it took a lot of guts for ChatGPT to say that to me, but it is complete nonsense. And that's when it occurred to me that Kash is not a law enforcement guy, never worked as a cop. And by the way, if you're going to become an FBI agent, you should have local police experience. I know that there are people who are hired without it, but federal law enforcement officers absolutely should have at least 2 years of local police experience. It changes the way you police. He's never had that, never been through law enforcement training. And now we realize not only is he not a gun guy, it's okay if you're not a gun guy, right? That's fine. I don't need everyone to be a gun guy. But he doesn't even know how they work. And he's the head of a law enforcement agency. That's weird.
Well, it's troubling. It's not weird. It's troubling.
It's troubling. It's having a sales guy the head of Boeing. It's Fannie Mae being headed by a lobbyist. It's showing that your center of gravity is not law enforcement. That whoever appointed him wants a center of gravity to be whatever the hell you bring as a podcaster.
And that's the point, right? I think that we saw this with Bongino, right? Actually working within the confines of rules, regulations, guardrails was too much for him. He had to go back to podcasting. Patel, I think, is in the same boat. He's like, wait, this isn't me just getting up, selling a couple of t-shirts and repeating the president's political lines. There's more to this job than that.
It's harder.
And I think right. And he's actually in that position. And I would argue so is Noam. I want to before we round it up because I want to be fair to criticizing the
Oh,
Minnesota
and
folks.
can
Go
one
ahead.
more point before
Sure.
you
Good.
judiciously move on?
Yeah.
All that was in the context of don't shoot your mouth off too soon,
Right.
because law enforcement professionals know better,
Right.
and the things that you should say that didn't get said.
Right.
You and I really haven't yet delved into the fact that what they did say were lies.
Well, yes, that was going to be the next thing I was going to get to. So, so
I,
thank you for the segue there, Mike.
you and I spend so much energy saying things like, wait for the facts to come out. We don't
Right.
want to prejudge. Maybe they saw something we didn't see. Let's be careful. I don't want to call them a liar.
Right.
In this case is so interesting because it is rare that you see someone being shot by law enforcement. And I stand up for my cop brothers.
Right. Of course.
I do. I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. I try to wait for all the facts to come out, and sometimes it's cringy, right? And you got to
Right.
wait and you hope
Right.
things are going to go okay. Rarely do you see a case like this one where law enforcement shot that guy after the gun had been removed from his person.
I think that's the part. There's a lot of this, and I agree with you, Mike. But there's a lot of this that when you look at the video from several angles,
A gun that he had never put his hand on.
right? It was even pre that. First of all, the standard, he was impeding and he resisted arrest. I saw neither. At worst, what you
He
could say,
decided to get in between pepper spray and the woman, so he caught the pepper spray himself.
I was going to say,
That's impeding. If you're stealing someone else's pepper spray, you're impeding, John.
yeah, I almost feel bad laughing. It's a good joke. I almost feel laughing because of the tragedy of the situation, because
Yeah.
you could see that, first of all, ICE, and again, I'm not going to argue whether they did it deliberately or in good judgment. They pushed a woman to the ground somewhat forcibly. Pretti was nearby, holding a phone in one hand, and with his other hand, sort of reached to support the woman who was on the ground. And you could hear him on various videos saying, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" At that point, one of the agents approached him while Pretti's back was turned to the agent and started spraying him heavily with pepper spray from behind. So you could see this sort of like dark brown
And
cloud.
Freddie, he did in defense of the one accusation that has a half truth to it.
Yeah.
He did get himself in between the woman who had been pushed to the ground and the agent,
Right.
which is probably as an ethical matter what he should have done, right?
Right.
He did for a fraction of a second have his front side toward the cop. He did put up his hand, whether that was to block pepper spray or to keep distance between him and the cop, I don't know.
Or to show my hand is empty.
Or maybe to show that his hand was, obviously it wasn't a threat. Could you argue that it was impeding? In the broadest definition of getting in my way as a cop, sure.
Right.
But that's, I just want to flag that as
Sure, sure.
possibly half true element of this ridiculous government narrative is
Right.
that at least it's true that he stepped into a situation.
Sure. And now at this point, I hate to use the word struggle, because struggle seems to be that two parties were engaged in a battle. There was a scuffle where the other agents sort of converged. Pretti was also taken to the ground. By my count, 3 or 4 agents. One of them spotted his holstered gun, and I think this is very important. Holstered gun. The agent,
It was in his the back of his waistband.
Right.
I don't know whether it was in a holster or not, but it was.
I believe I read that it was holstered, but it was in the back.
It was
like
in the back. It wasn't
and
in someone's hand.
Right.
Nor was it accessible. Nor was he trying to get his hands behind his back.
Yes, I think that's important as well. One of the agents, I think possibly the guy who initially threw this pepper spray, but I'm not 100% sure of that, reached in, saw the gun, grabbed it, and literally in the middle of the scuffle, and perhaps this is proper procedure, grabbed the gun out of the holster, and he turned and left the immediate scuffle, that particular
It is
agent.
good practice. It depends on how many officers are there. If
Right,
you're the only officer, what you want to do is shove that in your pocket, which is not always easy to do, right?
right.
Imagine you're wrestling with someone and trying to shove
Sure.
something in your pocket as large as a gun. That's not easy to do.
Right.
Uh,
So
Best practice is prone out your subject so he can't get to the gun. Hold his arms in place and wait for backup. Then someone takes the gun, removes it from the scene so that it's safe. What you don't want to do is just take it and toss it.
right.
Because, I mean, if you're a paranoid cop, as all cops should be to a certain extent, you don't like the idea of a gun loaded hanging around the street where some bad person can get it. So the cop did the right thing. Now, whether he said, someone did, gun, 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 so that everyone knows there's a gun or not, I don't know. But he did take it, put it in the car, and that's where it wound up.
Right. So the gun is removed. Pretti is still on the ground, and at that point, someone either yelled "gun" or I think you could hear the word "gun" being
Yep, yep, yep.
yelled
You
out.
heard,
But it was
someone said
clearly
it.
clearly after he had been disarmed, though, and then that led to Pretti being shot around about 10 times.
Yeah, the first shot came after the gun had been removed,
Correct.
but
Clearly,
immediately after, like
yes.
I would say less than a second, like tenths of a second after the gun was removed, um, the first shot was fired. It here's my here's my theory of what should be argued if you're the cop pulling the trigger. It's the only thing I can come up with,
Right.
right? If you're trying to build a case for the cop,
Right.
I saw the gun, I got confused. I thought it was Pretti grabbing it.
No, and I think that's what has been argued by ex-pundits who are,
It's the only.
yeah. But I'm not even going to argue at this stage, Mike, whether this was a legally defensible use of force. Because again, to your point, the bar is so high, even with the recent Supreme Court ruling that allows you to take the totality of events. I forget the
Totality
name.
of circumstances. It's a
Right.
long, there have been recent cases that have refined it, as
Yeah.
always, but it's a long standing element of criminal law, particularly in the context of law enforcement, that we take into consideration the totality of circumstances when evaluating a threat and whether or not an officer or anyone else could, whether their actions could reasonably be interpreted, could be interpreted as potentially reasonable.
Right.
In other words,
Right.
it's impossible to say that they were being unreasonable.
Correct. And I think I'm not even going to argue that right now because, again, I think that's not even the real point of this. I
Right.
think what we're trying to say is when you watch that video, I think to the overwhelming majority of reasonable people, to use that phrase, there was no proactive actions taken by Pretti to interfere with the actual enforcement action. I think, to your point, only under the most broad and generous definition of resisting arrest could you hit him up with that. And certainly, he was not a would be assassin who stalked law enforcement with the intention of mass murder.
Didn't even do enough to be arrested for resisting with violence. In the law, there's a difference between resisting with violence and resisting without violence.
By the way, Mike, my working theory is that before body cams, before cell phones, resisting arrest was simply a catch-all that cops used when they wanted to haul somebody in for questioning. Because if all else failed, it was the catch-all. Hey, he resisted arrest. He tugged on his arm as I was trying to cuff him or something. Growing
Right.
up in a place like New York, you knew how beat cops work, right? If the only thing you got hit with was resisting arrest, that means they had no case. I mean, I understand it's an add-on. It's a law. I get it.
Yeah.
But That's
Well, and
always
you
been
have
my
to, it's like
interpretation.
traffic stops. You have to be able to articulate what it was that caused you to want to arrest them in the first place. And typically, if you were an unethical and illegal cop 2 decades ago, what you would say is uh, that you were detaining them, not arresting them. You were detaining them to investigate pursuant to a reasonable suspicion that a crime had recently been committed and they may have been involved.
Right.
And for their safety and yours, you decided to put them in handcuffs, perfectly legal, for some period, reasonably short period of time during which you're going to conduct your investigation. And they resisted by pulling away.
Right.
And by pulling away, uh, the law says that that is definitionally resisting arrest, and you are allowed to use force. And that's how bad agencies would then justify the use of force. In the Pretti example, the police are probably going to argue that he resisted arrest because he didn't prone out on the ground fast enough, right? He was still on all fours.
After getting sprayed in the face with pepper
Exactly.
spray.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's, fair, lawful, ethical, but I'm saying that's probably what's going to be argued, is that he resisted because he was ordered to prone out on the ground, lay down on the ground, and he didn't do that. He was still on all fours, a la Rodney King,
Right.
right? And uh and 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 so they were using force to get him to do that. As you might have noticed, he gets punched in the head a whole bunch of times,
Yep.
possibly with a can, hard to tell, which is a tremendous amount of force for someone who's merely on all fours. But that, they're going to argue that he resisted, but you cannot argue that he resisted with violence. There was no violence. There's not even an attempt to show violence on Pretty's part.
Right. And certainly resisting arrest, and I think my MAGA friends or non-friends have to realize this, resisting arrest, especially without violence, as you noted, is not an excuse for summary execution.
Well,
And
obviously, right, right.
right. So I mean, the very fact that now we're saying, well, someone was killed during an incident with law enforcement officers, let's now regress, find every possible technical infraction he may or may not have committed, and then use that to justify his killing, which is what I think also is starting to weigh on people. And I'm not going to say just people opposed to the president, even supporters of the president. For example, a lot of libertarians, a lot of 2A rights people kind of scoffed when it may have been Patel or it may have been Bavino, I forget who it was, said, well, he may have had concealed carry, but part of concealed carry is having an ID. He never showed his ID as the officers approached him. And when you present that sort of justification, I think to a reasonable citizen, they'll say, like, what are you, out of your mind? He's, in the middle of all this, he's supposed to whip out his driver's license or whatever.
He wasn't asked for his ID.
He wasn't asked for it. That's the
He
first thing.
wasn't asked for his ID.
Right. So
That's important. Citizens, humans in this country are not required to wear a badge like you're, visiting the Smithsonian. You're not required to have a badge indicating either carry or driver's license or anything else. It's just an absolutely silly notion. And I think it was Bavino, but it was also Patel's comment about don't be bringing it to the protest, right?
right. Aren't courts the ones who are supposed to adjudicate intent?
Thank you. And the NRA came out and
Finally
said, let's have a full investigation, which was counter to the administration's assertions and narrative. And I
Yeah.
was very pleased to see that.
I was surprised that the NRA had not stepped in sooner, quite honestly, considering how quick they are to defend gun rights, say at a school shooting. They were awfully silent, in my opinion, again, in fear of political blowback. Or perhaps they were being prudent, take your choice. But I'm glad that they finally stood up for this guy who perhaps does not fill their typical members profile, right? Like typically speaking.
Yep.
So I'm glad to see that they spoke out. Okay, so I think we understand. I get the impression from you, Mike, just nod yes or no for the purposes of brevity, that you feel that this was ethically, if not legally, an unjustifiable shooting. Not legally. I understand that legally it's a very high bar. I'm saying as a
I think that
citizen.
it's going to be demonstrated that it was not legal. I think there's going to be criminal liability that attaches to that. And the fascinating part for me that I know you want to get to is that the administration decided not only to shoot its mouth off early, but to do so dishonestly. I find that absolutely fascinating and potentially telling of some things that we wish were not true.
Agreed, agreed. But in some small attempt to appear fair and balanced, no trademark infringement intended, uh, let me throw out some statements from Minnesota officials. Governor Tim Walz compared aspects of this of general ICE actions to the Holocaust and to Anne Frank's hiding, arguing that federal immigration enforcement is terrorizing communities, particularly in the wake of the two fatal shootings within 2 weeks of each other. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison said he was, quote, so concerned that the video is not being preserved that he sought a court order to protect all the evidence in this case, learning from the Good situation where all the evidence was seized by the FBI and not being shared. Minnesota officials asked a judge to limit the federal immigration surge and preserve evidence in the Pretti case. And then, in general, Minneapolis police and civil liberties advocates have called for more transparency and accountability in how federal agents operate within the state. Now, we've long said Minnesota's not handling this correctly either, in general.
Not only not correctly, but badly.
Badly, yes. They themselves are putting their citizens at risk by refusing to cooperate and provide basic policing support to whatever nonsense the Trump administration may or may not be doing in the state. We understand that. Specifically to this incident, though, how would you rate the public responses from the officials?
F.
Okay.
And there was one quote that I'll throw on the heap that you didn't mention.
Sure.
And the ones you did mention were bad enough. I think Ellison, including in his suit, the idea that the federal government might not be preserving evidence, that was a really bad idea. That was absolutely politically motivated. It was motivated to embarrass people. It's already illegal to mess with evidence. You don't need an extra law. You don't need a court order, right? It's like a court order that says drive in the right-hand side of the street. If someone served you an order that said that, I think you'd be upset. It's just grandstanding. And Walz comparing this to the Holocaust, s'il vous plaît. I mean, really, really profoundly bad. And not just bad because it's dopey. I mean,
Right.
Tim Walz does dopey things, before he gets to breakfast.
Right.
The reason it's so bad is because it amps up the protesters.
Correct.
What he should be telling protesters is do it legal, do it safe, keep your distance. It is not legal in Minnesota or anywhere else to impede law enforcement, whether it's MPD, Minnesota State, whether it's federal. You cannot get in the way. Don't stand in the street. By the way, don't blow the whistles. The reason people blowing the whistles, they think we are stupid. They think they're doing it because it draws attention and they like to be annoying. They know full well, and everyone who's had a whistle blown in their face knows full well, it's hard to go about your business with that whistle going off in your ear.
Right.
That's not legal. You do not have a legal right to impede a law enforcement officer or parenthetically anybody else. You're not allowed to walk up to someone on the street and blow a whistle in their face incessantly for 10 minutes so that they're incapacitated. That's not legal. And in doing so in front of a law enforcement officer is not legal either. This is what Walz should be telling people. And he should be backing that up by sending the state police to help with crowd control, but he has decided not to. So, him saying this is a very dangerous situation is true, but it's completely hypocritical in the sense that he is deciding not to do the things that he could decide to do to make it safer. And the same thing with Mayor Fry. What's his last name?
I think it's right, but I know who you're talking about. He's the
Yeah,
guy who
yeah.
initially,
The mayor
yeah,
who just wants to grandstand and keep MPD from helping out now is really stupid. In fairness, Christy Nome and Bovino are not asking for help either, as they should be. Nome and Bovino should be officially requesting state police and MPD to help with crowd control. Clearly, ICE is bad at it, lethally bad at it, unsafely bad at it. But I want to throw on one more quote there. Walz said this phrase, and again, it was one of those neck snappers for me. Pick a side. Pick a side. Have you not been in the United States the past decade? Like, you do
right.
not know what's going on. We do not have enough people already picking sides. We do not have polarized politics enough in this country already without you saying, pick a side. What? So now you want the citizens of Minnesota to pick between bad law enforcement, right?
Right.
Or
Bad protest.
bad protest. And what he's saying is me.
Yeah.
Choose me, who
Right.
refuses to send state police, who refuses to tell protesters to be safe, who refuses for MPD to go out there and help, who insists on embarrassing the federal government. They've done enough dumb things. That's easy,
Right.
right? Pick a side. That's really the message you want to give. How about everyone settle down and be safe? Pick a side. I thought pick a side was arguably in the top 5 things you would say if you wanted the situation to get worse.
And by the way, again, even if that was your position, it could have been presented in a much better way.
Of course.
Right? You could have said something along the lines of, it's time to demand justice. It's time to
Start writing letters, start making phone calls. Let's go
exactly.
protest outside of ICE headquarters. Let's get on a bus and go protest the Capitol building, the White House, Christy Nome's office. There are things that we can do other than blowing whistles in the middle of the street.
And to your point, I think this was your point. At the very least, provide crowd control. I mean, locally, even if those cops, those resources were not directly aiding in the actual ICE enforcement for whatever reason, if that's the way you chose to go, at least provide them the way you would at a parade route. Set up the barricades, put the cops there every 20 feet. Like, hey,
Orange cones.
Blow your whistles from
Police
behind
state.
there. Yeah, blow your whistles from behind there. Take all the video you want. We're here to protect you and to make sure you guys don't get shot by overzealous ICE agents. Like, I think even if Walz and the mayor took that position, we will not directly aid any of these enforcements, but we're here to protect our own citizens.
That is exactly how it should go. I'll tell you something else. My own personal experience is when the sergeant says, Mike, grab 3 guys and go set up a perimeter over there, keep the crowd, right, blah, blah, blah. The conversations that you have with your citizens are invaluable.
Of course.
You're a local cop. You're standing at the tape, right? Now, 50 feet behind you is a member of their community dead, right? This happened in the community I worked all the time, unfortunately, very violent,
Right.
spurts of violence. Community is upset. People are upset. They want to know what happened. Whether it was police involved or not, they're upset. When you stand at that police tape and you're holding up your hands, hey, folks, give us some time. This is going to be hours. This is going to be hours. And, we're 50 feet away. I don't want you going past blah, blah, blah. People then start yelling at you or talking to you.
Right.
Ma'am, what is it you want to tell me? Come here. Tell me. And she will.
Right.
This was my nephew's girlfriend's, brother's buddy, and I'm very upset. He was a good kid, and this is why
Yeah.
I'm upset. Oh my, tell me about it. Why can't we have a conversation? That's the difference between a local cop and a federal official.
Right.
When you're a local cop and you're responsible for 25,000 people, it's a different feel.
Sure.
You come across as giving a damn. If you do, and if you're a local cop, you will.
And it's your community at the end of the day. If you're a local cop, it's also your community too. It's not
It's where you go to work every day.
Right. It's not some theoretical I'm protecting the liberty of the United States as a whole, which is a lot more detached. It's I got to go eat breakfast every morning from the diner across the street from where this happened. It's like
Right.
That's why in the old days you always had the beat cops, the guys who on foot would go up and down the same 10 blocks in New York. You got to know them by name. They knew you by name. They knew the trouble you were getting into before you got into it. I remember the old Irish cop on my block would always pull me aside like, you're not planning to go hang out with the older kids at the arcade, are you? That's just a recipe for trouble. Like he would pull me aside and say that. Okay,
and he was probably right.
Sure, Officer O'Reilly, you're right. Then I'd go in the other direction, right? So to your, I mean, it's a little bit of a joke, but you're right because I think that touch is missing. And to your point, Waltz and the rest of them in Minnesota should be at least deploying forces and resources to protect their own citizens.
And this is why I say the sides are not police versus protesters, and they're not even Republicans versus Democrat, which I think is what Rawls really means.
Right, of course.
But our world has broken into two sides. And on one side are all the politicians who believe that they are advancing their careers through all of this polarization. And that includes Republicans and Democrats and stupid federal officials, right? And stupid prosecutors. All of them, all of these people who say nasty things in social media and who say nasty things about the other side. That's one team.
Right.
The other team is us. All the rest of us going about our business, right? Now, you might be a registered Republican, you might be a registered Democrat, you might be a registered Libertarian, you might not give a damn, and you might be someone who does give a damn, but you're independent. I don't care. You're on our team. Our team is all the non-politicians, all the people whose lives are being interrupted by the stupidity of these people whose careers are advanced through all of this acrimony and pick a side crap.
I agree, Mike. And as if sort of to illustrate this, the day of the shooting. Now, I don't know the timing. I don't know if this occurred before, during, or after the shooting of Pretti.
The shooting happened in the morning, and the event you're about to reference happened in the afternoon.
Okay. So now this...
I believe. I'm sorry. I'm guessing.
Right. Okay. So that's why I'll leave it as, I don't know the time of day this happened, but it happened on the day of the shooting. Reports of a sort of kind of quid pro quo started to make news, right? That Pam Bondi, our highly regarded U.S. Attorney General,
sarcasm noted,
sent Governor Tim Walz a letter demanding that Minnesota turn over its voter rolls, share data on Medicaid and SNAP recipients, and repeal, quote, sanctuary policies and, quote, support the ICE officers. This was while, not while, again, we don't know if it was during the actual shooting or not, but this letter was sent in the middle of Operation Metro Surge,
Yep.
which was this more intense level of immigration actions. Let's leave it at that. Uh, Now, Bondi's letter didn't necessarily say, turn that stuff over and we're out, but it kind of tied it into uh, common sense solutions, restoring law and order, ending chaos, quote, in Minnesota. Uh,
It certainly gave the impression that it would, to the extent to which you're interested in us pulling out, it would behoove you to give us the stuff we're asking for.
right. In some ways, it was the classic Trumpian offer, right? Like, I'm not saying I'm going to invade Greenland, but I'm not saying I'm not going to invade Greenland, right?
And
So
if
it's
you want Greenland not to be invaded, these are the
sell it.
things that you might decide on your own to do.
Right, exactly. So it certainly has a very Trumpian feel to it. But that aside, with this being made public, do you think, I'll give you three options, you tell me, does it make the administration look better? Does it make Minnesota look better? Or does it make neither look better?
It makes the administration look absolutely stupid.
Okay.
It does highlight the stupidity of Walz and Fry not allowing their own police force to help out to keep everybody safe, because that was bullet number 3. The third thing
Right.
that Bondi asked for was cooperation, and they're still not giving it. That's bad. So it did make Minnesota look bad. The letter necessarily was drafted before the shooting. There's no way they're getting that letter out same
Sure.
day.
Agreed.
It landed same day, but hours later, and the drafting of it had to come beforehand.
But Mike, just to interrupt, the context of that, I am sure was lost on 90% of the people who learned of this. Right, to them,
Yes,
the cosmic serendipity of it landing the day of this incident is what sticks in people's minds.
which is
You're right,
why every effort should have been made to stop that letter.
assuming it hadn't been sent out already. Yes.
Assuming it had not, my
Yeah.
understanding is it hit in the afternoon. Maybe that's just when the reports came. Every effort should have been made. And, you and I have discussed this before, that sometimes we need to hold our public officials to a higher standard than not, simply not being criminals.
Right.
I think that's where we've set the bar lately, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
But be a human being. Do me a favor. Be a grown up and a human being. Pick up the phone. Hey, listen. Funny thing, we drafted this letter last week and it went out. I know we've been mad at each other, right? I want things, you want things. We don't see eye to eye. We drafted this letter. It's going to come off a little bit nasty.
Right.
Because I was mad. Let me own this, Tim. This is Pam. This is, Tim. It's going to come off nasty because I was mad. I understand that there was another shooting this morning. I want to apologize for the awkward timing with which this letter is going to land. I'm not saying that it wasn't sincere. I still want to negotiate. I still, we're not retracting the letter. We still mean it. But believe me, I understand that when this hits, it's going to feel very different than, we had hoped that it would hit on a normal day. This is obviously not a normal day. And for that, I apologize. That's what an adult would do, right?
Right. Right.
And one of those things that you just know wasn't done.
Nor would it have been cared to be done. I think I would argue that's also, I agree with you 1,000%. Just approach it on a human level. But not only do I think that was not done, say, due to timing or bureaucratic red tape or miscommunication, I think if that thought ever entered Bondi's mind, it would have been shoved out immediately. I don't think anyone on that side of the fence, and again, I'm not exonerating the Minnesota side of this. I'm just saying, with respect to that letter, I don't think it would ever have been a consideration to say, let's not send that letter today or let me apologize for sending it today. I think it never even occurred to
I think your point may well be, and I'm not sure you'd be wrong if you were to make this point.
him.
There may have been people in the Department of Justice who actually said, you know what? Maybe that timing helps us.
There may have been. There may have been. I agree with
Not
you.
saying the shooting was a good thing, but saying, if
It
it
could have been
lands,
avoided.
if
It
it
could have been
lands on a
avoided.
really stressful day and emphasizes how important this stuff is, maybe that serves our interest.
I could easily see someone like Stephen Miller, for example, saying like, you know what? I'd add an addendum to that letter that says, and if you had done this last week, that would-be assassin would have never died today. I could actually see some elements of the Trump administration having that attitude. Like,
Okay, so let me get to the conversation I want to have.
sure, go ahead.
I want to ask you, because you brought up Stephen Miller.
Yeah,
Two-part question.
sure.
Is there any other administration in the history of our nation that would not have fired Stephen Miller for saying this was a would-be assassin? Not only was it premature, it was wrong. Not only was it wrong, but it was vindictive in a way. Not only was it vindictive, but substantively relevant. It was, people say stupid things around the office all the time. You don't get fired for it. Thank God. I mean, I've said my share of stupid things.
Right.
But you don't say stupid things in public that are so counter to the way things are typically managed that they rile up, seemingly and intentionally rile up a community. Is there any other administration in the history of our nation that would not have fired him? Number one.
Right.
Number two, why?
Yeah. Yeah. I to your first question, absolutely. I think forget actual feelings. I think politically he's a liability. Who is he appealing to? What is that kind of talk? And again, I think it all ties into the guardrails we're going to talk about and where this is headed. Because is he appealing to that to that portion of the president's base that hopefully is a small portion? But is he already talking to that portion that will never abandon President Trump, never abandon his policies? And is he just trying to incentivize or rile up that portion to take action that the president cannot ask for politically? And what I mean by that is his language. I've complained about this to you constantly since before the election. His language has always been militaristic. We've got invasion at the southern border. We are occupied by these illegal aliens. They're all murderers and thieves. We have to destroy these imminent threats of Venezuelan drug. Every word that falls out of his mouth is some form of warfare. And that might be fine in a campaign. You might argue that in the right doses, it might be fine in his position and public speaking. But this consistent imagery of a subclass of American humans, subclass of American citizens that don't deserve to be here, don't deserve to have the same rights as the privileged class, as the preferred political class, is just ongoing with this guy. So to your point, if he hasn't been fired as a political liability, that means he's being kept on as a political plus. And who views him that way?
And by the way, it's not just that he continues to be employed. He continues to be put in front of cameras.
Yeah. Like, so...
you can imagine if you or I were to shoot our mouth off with a whole bunch of libertarian stuff, right, and we worked for the Biden administration, right? You would expect someone who works for the president to say, look,
cool it.
Behave yourself and you won't get fired.
Right.
But if you see a camera coming, you go to the men's room.
Well, see, and to that point, right, there's a couple of things that happen immediately after this that to me is fascinating, right? So in the days that followed, and believe me, as you and I were putting together these notes, the conversation had already shifted, right? Like this thing is a constant thing, right? So after we put these notes together yesterday, we find out Bovino's being sent back to Texas. Somebody
Right.
finally decided this guy has no business being in Minnesota running these types of operations.
Greg, we
And it,
hardly knew you.
right. And much to our continued shock and awe, one of the guys that we thought would never, when did we ever say, thank God for Tom Homan? He's the spokesperson we need. He was, according to reports, dispatched to Minnesota last night with Trump saying he will not report to Noam, he will report directly to me.
Yeah. I
Which
thought that was fascinating.
It was, because to me, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of indicates from Trump's point of view, look, I did Lewandowski a favor and I made her secretary of DHS. Someone cashed in a political chip and we put this woman here, clearly not qualified for the job. I don't know if anybody else realizes this, but her job is not to show up all decked out at ICE enforcement. She's in charge of the security of this entire nation and all its aspects. She is supposed to be counterterrorism. She's supposed to be doing surveillance, not just on poor immigrants in this country. She's supposed to be, for example, looking at threats from ISIS, from, all these other potential threats.
I don't even understand, maybe you can answer, why is she the face of this operation?
Well, I think we know why. Right? The president values attractive, what he deems to be attractive women on camera. We see it with Bondi.
So how do you explain Greg?
Yeah, well, I think that's the sub one, right? The sub one is someone got into Trump's ear or got into Noam's ear. I don't know that. I'd love to pin Bovino on Trump, but I don't know that's the case. So maybe Miller got to Noam and said, you know what? You're looking too soft on this immigration stuff. Let's throw in Bovino because he's a tough talker. He's
to the microphone once in a while.
Yeah,
and now between the two of them and this dopey messaging, they've caused the president a problem. And that's why Tom is going out to Minneapolis.
So I'll give you a quick chance to pontificate, Mike.
Tom was the only guy who said,
let's wait.
Let's wait.
You're right. And you mentioned this last time. He's the only one who actually has law enforcement experience.
So he knows, even if he doesn't mean it and feel it, he knows that you got to wait. All cops have been in this situation. When I was a local cop, a buddy of mine, maybe he got into it, something happened, but I knew that he did the right thing, right? And you want to answer the questions of the press who are then hanging around, and you want to tell them, hey, I saw what happened. He did the right thing. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but let me explain. No, you have to shut up, and it's hard. But Tom has that experience. So he knows to shut. Now, in this particular case, he probably also knows that he's got a cluster on his hands and the cops didn't do the right thing. But at least he knows to shut up.
Right. So let me give you a chance to play Karnak the Magnificent here for those of us old enough to remember the reference. Do you think Homan will make the situation better in Minnesota? And do you think that Noam is on her way out at DHS? I know you hate doing that, but I figured I'd make it tough for you. The card. Yes.
The card. In Johnny Carson's case, I think it was inside the envelope, but right. He would say, in answer to your question, he would say something like, a package and a package deal. And then he would open it up and he would read it and he would say, Tom is the package being delivered to Minneapolis. And that's a package that comes directly from the president. And that makes it a good thing in the sense that it resets.
Right.
It gives everyone a chance to say, whatever happened before today, this is from the president. He wants us to calm down. And, even if you didn't mean it, even if it's just a political reaction, it creates an opportunity. So I would actually be optimistic that Tom makes a positive contribution. I don't think it's going to be one that solves our problem. It's not going
Right.
to calm people down. It's not going to give walls enough incentive to all of a sudden cooperate or to stop saying stupid things. But can it buy us a couple of weeks maybe where the hatred calms down? Maybe. And I would say uh, it can't get much worse than it is right now in a sustainable fashion anyway. So I think on the margin, maybe it gets better. Let me be optimistic about that. And what I meant by package deal is I think that there's something that has to be handled in a complex fashion for everyone to save face. Maybe it's Noam gets a different job. Maybe Noam is sidelined for camera purposes, and they pick someone else, whether it's Tom or I mean, surely there's a chief information officer, there's a press secretary, right, that
Right.
reports to Noam who can handle this a little bit better. Maybe you bring in someone who has some experience in law enforcement as an information officer for a law enforcement agency, for the FBI, maybe. Someone who knows how to speak with credibility, and when they don't want to speak with credibility, they know to shut the heck up. But I
Right.
think it's a package deal. There's a few moving parts there that have to be handled. And the last thing that I think is worth saying that I wanted to say to you today, John, is I'm very worried because of the length of time it has been since the president has done this. You know, it took a long time to send Tom. I think sending Tom Homan was at least a step in the right direction. And until then, you got the impression that the administration was okay with greater chaos, greater polarization, that they were not upset by the incompetence of ICE. And I don't mean to say that everything that ICE has done has been incompetent, but there's been enough of it that it's highlighted what are either training issues or attitude issues. And up until now, it just seems like it's been too much tolerance of too much incompetence. So I was glad to see that at least they're trying to do something.
And one would hope, to your point, with Homan being there under being and it being public that he's there reporting directly to the president, that adults in the room might get together and go something like this. Hey, Tim Waltz, Tom Homan on the phone here. Look, things have gotten out of hand here a little bit. Why don't we try to make a deal, as the president would like to say? I'm going to give you a list of the 10 most wanted targets of our efforts here in Minnesota. Why don't you make sure we go in, we don't make a big deal out of parading armored vehicles through the streets of Minneapolis. We know you know where these people are, we know where these people are. Why don't you give me a couple of stadies? We go, we grab these guys, we get all 10, and then we're out. Then you and the president can negotiate what to do with voter rolls, Medicare fraud, and the rest of the political nonsense. I'm here to get these 10 guys, and I'm here to do it without any more dead Americans in the streets.
And I want to look good doing it. And if you end up looking good too, that doesn't bother me so bad.
Exactly. Do you think there's any shot in hell, Mike? That's a conversation that takes place?
I think there's a shot in hell. 50-50? No.
Okay.
But a shot in hell? Yes, absolutely. There's a shot in hell. And that's only because Tom is an experienced law enforcement officer, not because he's got the right incentive structure in place. It's going to have to come from him personally.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And if it helps, he does seem to have a little bit of cover from a lot of GOP, high-ranking GOP members. Like, I think Ted Cruz has started to mention some sort of pushback.
That is exactly right. And there's another thing worth pointing out is that in Tom Homan, we're talking about a guy who actually received an award
From
from
Obama.
President Obama's
Yeah.
administration when the Obama administration was all about deporting a lot of people in a hurry.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, not to this scale,
No,
obviously.
not to this scale, but millions, in the millions.
Yes.
Not to
Yeah.
this scale, but eventually over the 8 years, it was millions. A lot of self deportation. It was not
Right.
quite the same thing, but we don't have a lot of reason to believe that Holman is going to just come right out of the box and treat Walz and Fry like children just because they're Democrats.
Yeah.
In that sense, he may actually have a better shot at success than even someone like I would. If I were there in that room, I'd come out of the box pissed. I'd be
Right.
like, why are you not sending the state police? And maybe that's part of the conversation too.
Sure.
But I'd be
Sure.
pissed, why have you not sent state police? Why have you not sent local PD? And then to layer your rhetoric of wanting safety on top of your actions that say otherwise really bothers me a lot.
Right.
And that is the kind of thing that you've got to eat. You can't just come out of the box and say that if you're going to have an honest negotiation toward a resolution. So good luck to them. It's not easy.
Yeah. And I know we didn't put this on the show notes, but I want to toss this out to you. Friday, there needs to be a budget approval process.
Yep.
And part of that is going to be appropriations for ICE.
Yep.
Now, the House has already approved it, as one would expect, given
Yep.
the Republican majority and perhaps only
Party
Thomas
line
Massey.
vote.
Yeah, except for Thomas Massey, everybody fell along party lines, right?
Massey has a hard time voting to spend money on anything, though, in fairness.
Absolutely.
That's why we love him.
Yes, absolutely. Ron Paul Jr. there. But anyway, but in the Senate, though, it's a different story. Like I mentioned, Ted Cruz, who's not Kennedy, the other senator from Louisiana, is it Russell? Somebody that Trump has decided to target and primary.
Yep.
The person who voted for his impeachment. I'm sorry, his name escapes me right now.
Yep.
The junior senator from Louisiana.
Yep.
Murkowski has spoken out against him.
Yep.
You see now that several GOP senators will team up potentially with the Democrat senators. They will not get a 60 votes to continue funding ICE as is.
Right.
To me, the question is, will enough of the quote rebels who are going against Trump on this, are they going to push for funding ICE with reforms? For example, cutting down the number of people, sticking to strict legal things like getting legal warrants instead of administrative warrants, which are two different things. Or do you feel this level of funding for ICE is done? Do you think like, hey, we've learned a lesson. We don't want armies rolling through the cities?
I think that won't fly. The idea of reducing funding, I don't think will fly because it would be a direct affront to President Trump's agenda.
Well, Rand Paul has said, you have asked for funding that's on the level of national defense, meaning like the level of the U.S. Marines for ICE, which is unheard of.
Yep.
What's wrong with throwing it back to its prior level of spending?
I'm not saying there'd be anything wrong with the argument. I just don't think it would be successful in the sense that it would be directly contradicting the White House's objectives, as opposed to what would be more in Rand Paul's wheelhouse, which is confronting the administration in terms of how this policy is executed.
Gotcha.
In my estimation, these senators would have greater political traction if they were to say, we'll agree to the coin, but we need, 3 reforms. One is what you mentioned, the warrant issue. You do not want a federal agency signing its own administrative warrants. That's a bad idea. You got to go to the court to get a warrant. And if there's already a deportation order, that's enough. I get that. But the other ones, would include possibly, as you and I have discussed, ICE doesn't go in unless there's local cooperation. And that doesn't have to mean the governor signs off. It doesn't have to mean the mayor signs off. But it does mean that we need local assistance in terms of crowd control, for example.
Right.
And I could imagine that being a way for a number of senators to declare some victory politically. By the way, and to have some actual victory, there is an opportunity when you could actually do something politically useful for yourself and make America safer. It's a twofer.
Exactly. Right.
How often does that come up, right? And at the same time, give deference to President Trump's agenda, which is what he wants. He doesn't want these senators arguing in his face that the whole thing is dopey. By the way, I think the amount of money is too much. If you're keeping your promise that you're just going after the worst of the worst and you want to do so in a safely manner, you could do that in less money, and you can only keep people safe if you go in with local PD support. So I would suggest that anything that they could negotiate for would be going in the right direction. But as a matter of politics, I think they're going to have to settle for a couple of reforms.
And at this point, maybe that's the best we can hope for until the midterm elections. And obviously that's on a lot of people's minds, right? Because not every Republican is a MAGA Republican, right? There are still some quote traditional conservatives, traditional Republicans who will not have the cover of saying we're supporting Trump in 2028. They will have now to stand on their own votes and their own they'll have to explain, why did I support this, and the answer can't be because of Trump. It's
Well,
got
you're
to be
right. You're right. Not only are you right, but I would say you're right times two, in the sense that those who have been the biggest Trump supporters have been so because they viewed President Trump as someone who would disrespect dishonest institutions. If you're supporting President Trump because he is the kind of guy who disrespects dishonest institutions, you cannot like people in administration being dishonest in support of these institutions.
right.
It just flies in the face. It's the same thing as going against release of the Epstein files to lie on behalf of ICE.
Right.
So it is hard to shake your most ardent supporters. But if you really wanted to get rid of your most ardent supporters, this is how you would do it.
Very quick question. We didn't plan for this, and the other thing we're going to talk about, we're
This
going
is
to
the
table
third
for a
thing
different
you brought
episode.
up that you said you
I
didn't
know
plan for this. I think you
it,
planned for this, but go ahead.
it's my fault, and I'm keeping track of the time, and we're trying to keep it now under 90 minutes. But
Is it still Tuesday? Go ahead.
um, do you think that the president's supporters on certain issues he's talking to the same slice of Republican voters, or are these interest groups that are additive? By example, I know that was a question. For example, are the folks who are upset over the Epstein file situation the same slice that would be upset over the ICE situation? Or are they two distinct slices of support that are additive? And the reason I ask that is, if the same 20% are upset about ICE, that are upset about the Epstein files, that are upset about tariffs, then the president can ignore them. They're just that 20%. But if it's 20% from three non-intersecting sets, that's a bigger problem, because now the total of people who might turn against MAGA goes from 20% to 40, 50%. Do you understand the question?
I
Like,
totally understand the question. I think that it's largely the same group, which is why I mentioned this concept of people that hang with him because they thought he would stand up to dishonest
right,
institutions like the FBI that's not releasing the Epstein files, or stand up to ICE who's shooting people and then lying about it, right? And but if I were the president's political advisor, which I'm obviously not,
right,
I would say that this nonetheless presents new risk for him, even though it might not be offending a different group, it might just be offending the same group a second time, because you need to offend them 3 times to get rid of them.
right,
They're so ardent, right? Okay,
right,
I offended them by not releasing the Epstein files and by covering it up and by marginalizing and insulting Marjorie Taylor Greene. That was bad. A lot of people mad at me. Now I go to those same people who want me to be telling the truth, full disclosure types. And I say, we're not going to have a good investigation of these shootings. I'm going to stand up for another opaque law enforcement institution. I'm insulting
right.
the same people a second time. Now they're really mad, right? Now they're really mad. But they're still going to hang with me. Okay. Let me see if I can really get rid of these people, right? Now what I'm going to do is have secret negotiations with the Europeans to heavy-handed shove the Greenlanders into agreeing on some
Right.
BS that I want, right? My point is that some of these issues have the same flavor. There's an honesty thing, there's an anti-institutional thing,
Right.
and at some point, even your most ardent supporters, maybe you only shake a few of them off with one insult and you only shake a few of them off with another insult. But at some point, it starts to bite. And if you're
Yeah.
JD Vance running for president, you can't be happy about that.
Agreed. Agreed.
Thank
Okay. And as promised, I'm going to shut up now. All right. So you've been watching Liberty Lens. Please do us a favor. Smash the subscribe button. Leave a comment. How about you answer a question? Should body cam footage be required of federal officers instead of having the budget cut for them? Maybe that's something you want to talk about in the comments. Go ahead and leave a comment. Mike and I will answer you as best we can in there. Until next time, for Mike Termott, this has been Big John. Peace, everyone.